Mchav Marcos. Facts. Petitioner was created by virtue of RA 6958, mandated to principally undertake the economical, efficient, and effective control, management and supervision of the Mactan International Airport in the province of Cebu and the La Hague Airport in Cebu City. Under Section 1, the authority shall be exempt from realty taxes imposed by the national government or any of its political subdivisions, agencies, and instrumentalities. However, the officer of the treasurer of Cebu City demanded payment for realty taxes on parcels of land belonging to petitioner. Petitioner objected, invoking its tax exemption. It also asserted that it is an instrumentality of the government performing governmental functions, citing Section 133 of the LGC, which puts limitations on the taxing powers of LGUs. The city refused, insisting that petitioner is a GOCC performing proprietary functions whose tax exemption was withdrawn by Sections 193 and 234 of the LGC. Petitioner filed a declaratory relief before the RDC. The trial court dismissed the petitioner, ruling that the LGC withdrew the tax exemption granted the GOCCs. Issue 1. The City of Cebu has the power to impose taxes on petitioner. Held yes. Ratio, as a general rule, the power to tax is an incident of sovereignty and is unlimited in its range, acknowledging in its very nature no limits. So that security against its abuse is to be found only in the responsibility of the legislature, which imposes the tax on the constituency who are to pay it. Since taxes are what we pay for civilized society, or are the lifeblood of the nation, the law frowns against exemptions from taxation, and statutes granting tax exemptions are thus construed strictissimi juris against the taxpayers and liberally in favor of the taxing authority. A claim of exemption from tax payment must be clearly shown and based on language in the law too plain to be mistaken. There can be no question that under Section 14 RA 6958 the petitioner is exempt from the payment of realty taxes imposed by the national government or any of its political subdivisions, agencies, and instrumentalities. Nevertheless, since taxation is the rule and exemption is the exception may thus be withdrawn at the pleasure of the taxing authority. The LGC, enacted pursuant to Section 3, Article X of the Constitution, provides for the exercise by LGUs of their power to tax, the scope thereof or its limitations, and the exemption from taxation. Section 133 of the LGC prescribes the common limitations on the taxing powers of LGUs. Taxes, fees, or charges of any kind on the national government, its agencies and instrumentalities, and LGUs. Among the taxes enumerated in the LGC is real property tax. Section 234 of LGC provides for the exemptions from payment of GOCCs, except as provided therein. On the other hand, the LGC authorizes LGUs to grant tax exemption privileges. Reading together Section 133, 232 and 234 of the LGC, we conclude that as a general rule, as laid down in SECS 133, the taxing powers of LGUs cannot extend to the levy of inter alia, taxes, fees, and charges of any kind of the national government, its agencies and instrumentalities, and LGUs. However, pursuant to Sector 232, provinces, cities, municipalities in the metropolitan Manila area may impose the real property tax except on, inter alia, real property owned by the Republic of the Philippines or any of its political subdivisions, except when the beneficial use thereof has been granted to a taxable person. As to tax exemptions or incentives granted to or presently enjoyed by natural or juridical persons, including government-owned and controlled corporations, Section 193 of the LGC prescribes the general rule, viz. They are withdrawn upon the effectivity of the LGC, except upon the effectivity of the LGC, except those granted to local water districts, cooperatives duly registered under RA number 6938, non-stock and non-profit hospitals and educational institutions, and unless otherwise provided in the LGC. The latter proviso could refer to Section 234, which enumerates the properties exempt from real property tax. But the last paragraph of Section 234 further qualifies the retention of the exemption insofar as the real property taxes are concerned by limiting the retention only to those enumerated therein. All others not included in the enumeration lost the privilege upon the effectivity of the LGC. Moreover, even as the real property is owned by the Republic of the Philippines, or any of its political subdivisions covered by item of the first paragraph of Section 234, the exemption is withdrawn if the beneficial use of such property has been granted to taxable person for consideration or otherwise. Since the last paragraph of Section 234 unequivocally withdrew, upon the effectivity of the LGC, exemptions from real property taxes granted to natural or juridical persons, including GOCCs, except as provided in the said section. And the petitioner is, undoubtedly, a government-owned corporation, it necessarily follows that its exemption from such tax granted it in Section 14 of its charter, RA No. 6958, has been withdrawn. Any claim to the contrary can only be justified if the petitioner can seek refuge under any of the exceptions provided in Section 234, but not under Section 133, as it now asserts, since, as shown above, the said section is qualified by Section 232 and 234. In short, the petitioner can no longer invoke the general rule in Section 133. It must show that the parcels of land in question, which are real property, are any one of those enumerated in Section 234, either by virtue of ownership, character, or use of the property. Most likely, it could only be the first, but not under any explicit provision of the said section, for one exists. In light of the petitioner's theory that it is an instrumentality of the government, it could only be within the first item of the first paragraph of the section by expanding the scope of the terms Republic of the Philippines to embrace instrumentalities and agencies. This view does not persuade us. In the first place, the petitioner's claim that it is an instrumentality of the government is based on Section 133, which expressly mentions the word instrumentalities, and in the second place it fails to consider the fact that the legislature used the phrase national government, its agencies, and instrumentalities in Section 133. But only the phrase Republic of the Philippines or any of its political subdivision in Section 234. The terms Republic of the Philippines and national government are not interchangeable. The former is border and synonymous with Government of the Republic of the Philippines, which the Administrative Code of the 1987 defines as the corporate governmental entity through which the functions of the government are exercised. Throughout the Philippines, including, saves as the contrary appears from the context, the various arms through which political authority is made effective in the Philippines, whether pertaining to the autonomous region, the provincial, city, municipal or barangay subdivision or other forms of local government. These autonomous regions, provincial, city, municipal or barangay subdivisions are the political subdivision. On the other hand, national government refers to the entire machinery of the central government, as distinguished from the different forms of local governments. The national government then is composed of the three great departments: the executive, the legislative and the judicial. An agency of the government refers to any of the various units of the government, including a department, bureau, office, instrumentality, or government-owned or controlled corporation, or a local government or a distinct unit therein. While an instrumentality refers to any agency of the national government, not integrated within the department framework, vested with special functions or jurisdiction by law, endowed with some if not all corporate powers, administering special funds, and enjoying operational autonomy, usually through a charter. This term includes regulatory agencies, chartered institutions, and government-owned and controlled corporations. If Section 234 intended to extend the exception therein to the withdrawal of the exemption from payment of real property taxes under the last sentence of the said section to the agencies and instrumentalities of it, national government mentioned in Section 133, then it should have restated the wording of the latter. Yet, it did not. Moreover, that Congress did not wish to expand the scope of the exemption in Section 234 to include real property owned by other instrumentalities or agencies of the government, including government-owned and controlled corporations, is further borne out by the fact that the source of this exemption is Section 40 of PD number 646, otherwise known as the Real Property Tax Code. Note that as reproduced in Section 234, the phrase "and any government-owned or controlled corporation so exempt by its charter" was excluded. The justification for this restricted exemption in Section 234 seems obvious: to limit further tax exemption privileges. Especially in light of the general provision on withdrawal of exemption from payment of real property taxes in the last paragraph of property taxes in the last paragraph of Section 234. These policy considerations are consistent with the state policy to ensure autonomy to local governments 33 and the objective of the LGC that they enjoy genuine and meaningful local autonomy to enable them to attain their fullest development as self-reliant communities and make them effective partners in the attainment of national goals. 34. The power to tax is the most effective instrument to raise needed revenues to finance and support myriad activities of local government units for the delivery of basic services essential to the promotion of the general welfare and the enhancement of peace, progress, and prosperity of the people. It may also be relevant to recall that the original reasons for the withdrawal of tax exemption privileges granted to government-owned and controlled corporations and all other units of government were that such privilege resulted in serious tax base erosion and distortions in the tax treatment of similarly situated enterprises, and there was a need for these entities to share in the requirements of the development, fiscal or otherwise, by paying the taxes and other charges due from them. The crucial issues then to be addressed are, whether the parcels of land in question belong to the Republic of the Philippines whose beneficial use has been granted to the petitioner, and whether the petitioner is a taxable person. It may be reasonable to assume that the term lands refer to lands in Cebu City then administered by the La Hague Airport and includes the parcels of land the respondent city of Cebu seeks to levy on for real property taxes. This section involves a transfer of the lands among other things, to the petitioner and not just the transfer of the beneficial use thereof, with the ownership being retained by the Republic of the Philippines. This transfer is actually an absolute conveyance of the ownership thereof because the petitioner's authorized capital stock consists of the value of such real estate owned and/or administered by the airports. Hence, the petitioner is now the owner of the land in question and the exception in Sector 234 of the LGC is inapplicable. Petitioner cannot claim that it was never a taxable person under its charter. It was only exempted from the payment of real property taxes. The grant of the privilege only in respect of this tax is conclusive proof of the legislative intent to make it a taxable person subject to all taxes, except real property tax. Finally, even if the petitioner was originally not a taxable person for purposes of real property tax, in light of the foregoing disquisitions, it had already become, even if it be conceded to be an agency or instrumentality of the government, a taxable person for such purpose in view of the withdrawal in the last paragraph of Section 234 of exemptions from the payment of real property taxes, which, as earlier adverted to, applies to the petitioner. Accordingly, the position taken by the petitioner is untenable. Reliance on Bosco v. Espadker is unavailing since it was decided before the effectivity of the LGC. Besides, nothing can prevent Congress from decreeing that even instrumentalities or agencies of the government performing governmental functions may be subject to tax. where it is done precisely to fulfill a constitutional mandate and national policy, no one can doubt its wisdom.